afternoon, everyone. My name is Aranza Sulaskarine, and I'm the Assistant University Director here at the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, and thank you for joining us for a webinar series on the 4th National Climate Assessment, which we commonly refer to as the NCA4, where we're specifically exploring the Southeast chapter. We will also be focusing shortly next month on the Caribbean chapter. And in March, we'll be doing an overview of the Tribes and Indigenous Peoples chapter. So our intention with these webinars is for you all to hear directly from each of the key message lead authors with the opportunity to have a Q&A with them at the end of the presentation. So please keep in mind that we also want to make sure that the audience knows how to use all the components and resources and data within each of the key messages. So we'd love to run a super quick poll. Thank you in advance for participating. This poll will help us know how best to continue disseminating the NCA4 material and to gauge who our audience is today. So we'll give you a minute to fill out this poll. Great. Well, thank you very much for filling that out. This is really helpful. We have a little, representation from quite a few different agencies, which is great to know, including a community member and some NGOs. And we appreciate also knowing that some of you have yet to use the information in the report. So that's really helpful for us. Again, thank you very much. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce today Kirstin Dow. Dr. Dow is the Carolina Trustees Professor of Geography at the University of South Carolina. She is a social environmental geographer focusing on understanding climate impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation using extensive participation of stakeholders and decision makers. Dow serves as principal investigator of the Carolinas Integrated Sciences and Assessments, known as CISA. It is a NOAA-supported program that partners with decision makers to bridge climate science and decision making in support of climate adaptation strategies specific to water, coasts, and public health in the Carolinas. And just a quick overview of the purpose of the National Climate Assessment. It is run through the U.S. Global Change Research Program. It was established by an act of Congress in 1990. And among the mandates in that law was a requirement for a quadrennial assessment of how climate is changing and how those changes are impacting a variety of sectors across the country. And over time, stakeholder demand for the scientific advances have allowed an increased focus on more localized information. The 4th National Climate Assessment emphasized regional information from its inception through extensive stakeholder engagement and a structural decision to make the regional chapters more detailed. We'll have a 15-minute opportunity for an in-depth Q&A with Kirstin after her presentation. So again, thank you for joining us today, Kirstin. Thank you very much. Share her screen. Kirstin, can you hear us? You probably need to reshare your screen.
I need to reshare my screen?
Yes.
It says I was unmuted by the host, and now...
Correct. And we can hear you.
And you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
And let me find the right box to get myself unmuted, or to share the screen.
Yeah.
One moment.
Sure, no worries.
Okay, share. How's that? Yeah, how's that?
It's coming. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Thank you.
All right. Great. There's all sorts of other things going on here that I need a little work with my. All right. Still good?
Yep, still good.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for that. Bearing with me for a little technology. We thought we had it in hand. I'm happy to talk about the rural section of the Southeast chapter, and it's a really important and interesting dimension of what's happening in the South. 56% of our land is rural, the majority of the land, but it's only 17% of the regional population, about 16 million people. And one of the challenges is how spread out these people are. We'll talk about that. But what I'd like to look at today is first briefly review the kinds of climate changes we've observed and those we project, and then to talk a little bit about how those interact with rural livelihoods and with existing stresses in the region, and then finish up with thinking about where the opportunities are for risk reduction, climate-related risk. So the first thing I should remind people of is sometimes we think we've got a large agricultural presence in the Southeast, but that's not all that's happening in the rural areas. The economies of the rural Southeast are very diversified. Here we've got some agriculture next to some shipping, and recent data from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta shows that in the rural areas, the ones in blue, that it's about 26% manufacturing employment in those areas. So one of the things a friend from a farming community said is, or from a rural community said is, we don't all want to be considered farmers. It's a little, we don't actually find it a little offensive that everyone assumes that if you live in a rural area, you're a farmer. And so just to look at that, because it'll be more important as we talk about impacts. I also wanted to remind people that unfortunately the Southeast region has a history of lagging development investment in many areas. And as we come forward looking at current issues, areas of persistent poverty and minimal services in some areas are an ongoing challenge for really reducing risks in the area. All right, so what's happened? Well, this is not news to people on the call that we're already seeing the climate changes. It's here, it's now. It doesn't present itself uniformly over space. We have a distribution here where you can see the general trend of increase over the region from the 1900s to the 2010s. And if you look at the map with the dots on it, you can see that some areas are seeing a greater change and some areas see a little bit of a decrease. But we are seeing that in parts of the Southeast that pattern of increasing days of precipitation over 3 inches are increasing. We're also seeing other kinds of extreme events that influence the area. This is the October 2015 rainfall event, and we're looking at rainfall recurrence intervals on this map. It's done for the Southeast, or for Carolina, North and South Carolina. And some of them are, the governor called it a 1,000-year event, and that caused some consternation among scientists. Was it 1,000 years, or was it more than 1,000 years, or was it somewhere in between? Well, it sort of depended on which station you looked at, is what you see in this map, but it was an awful lot enormous amount of rain, including the record set in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, down here along the coast, where one of the citizen science observers recorded almost 27 inches of rain. And the understanding of this particular storm is that the warm rainfalls, the warm ocean temperatures off the coast contributed to the volume of water that was held in that storm and the amount that was deposited over land. We're also seeing increases in the number of hot days and the warm nights. Again, we've got the time series graph on the left and the station graph on the right, with the increases in not so many, in some places in days over 95, but really a clear signal in the number of warm night minimum temperatures above 75 degrees. And these are the mornings when you come out in the southeast and you're like, it's already hot, it's already muggy. And this will become a particularly important point in thinking about impact, because this is the time when we need some sort of relief from the heat of the day. Even if it doesn't reach over 95, it can still be quite hot and humid and physically stressful on people and animals. The other observation we know here, this is Fort Pulaski off Georgia, is that we're seeing increases in the number of high tide flooding days. This one shows that steady increase with the intermediate scenario, but it's very highly variable. And there have been, in Charleston last year, it was close to 25% of days had some impact of high tide flooding. And hopefully that will just be a sort of a blip, and it'll go back to lower numbers and a slower trend. But the general trend is upward, even if there's variability there. And all these matter for the coast as well as these cities. Just to comment on the hurricanes, which reach from the coast all the way inland, as we recognize, often with more severe impacts inland these days. The development of Hurricane Irma as a huge storm was really supported by the warm waters it passed over, so it was able to take heat energy from those waters, and also because of the climate that it met at the time. There were very light winds in the upper atmosphere, so the process of blocking that upward circulating cone of air that sometimes happens when there's heavy wind that can just sort of shear across it and interrupt that cyclone was not encountered. And the expectation is that Irma is expect something like Irma with these larger storms and the more intense rainfall are expected to be more common in the future due to climate change. The expectation at the moment is not an increase in the overall number of hurricanes, but these larger, wetter storms is a concern that people are finding in their model work. I showed you a number of warm nights that we've observed. The expectation is that that's going to continue, and it depends on where the global emissions go, really. We've got a higher and lower scenario here from the NCA4. In some areas, we could be looking at as many as 150 plus nights of about half a year of temperatures with minimum nighttime temperatures over 75 degrees. And again, that really reduces people's ability to find a place to get a break from the heat. If you had a long, stressful day, your body needs a chance to recover from that. And when the temperatures don't drop that much overnight, it becomes a problem, and it will influence outdoor work patterns. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. The warmer temperatures also create the possibility of increasing the abundance of disease-carrying mosquitoes. And one of them in particular is a concern. Aedes aegypti is a mosquito. You can tell it from the white stripes on its body. I should have included a picture, but the thing about this mosquito is it's so easily adapted to human areas. And they say that you should sort of empty the water, anything that might contain water around your house. When Aedes aegypti, they're perfectly happy if it's the saucer underneath a small plant. They don't need a lot of water, and they don't. And there's so many nooks and crannies that hold a little bit of water that suits this particular species. It makes it particularly difficult to deal with. And the kinds of things that we're talking about are diseases that we don't, that we're not familiar with in this area: dengue, yellow fever, Zika, others that we're not prepared on a broad scale to encounter. The heat also brings with it this change in plant hardiness zones. So sometimes the gardeners are the first people to notice the changes because they're out there every day watching over the years what's possible. And the northward shift of hardiness zones is already taking place. This one shows you where the zones have been, with the real tropical ones down in Florida, and the sort of the cooler areas up there, Kentucky, Tennessee, the sort of Smoky Mountains, Appalachian area in the blue on the historic side. The possibility now is that more freeze-sensitive plants will be able to move north or be planted in the north. Oranges, papayas, mangoes, all wonderful plants. I have no problem with that. We've got a large change in Kentucky. The plant hardiness zone could also apply to the movement of weeds, though. So as we see this possibility for crops that we might enjoy having, we also know that that creates a habitat for other possible species in the area. From there, I'd like to just transition to talk a little bit about projected impacts. One of the nice things about the NCA4 was that it was able to draw on a major economic impact study that was done through the US EPA, and it brought out more of the potential costs and potential impacts on rural livelihoods that are going to be very significant in the Southeast. And it's been the first time we've been able to talk about this kind of impact at a regional scale. So I want to share with you some of those numbers. In terms of important activities in the rural South, our fishing, our working waterfronts and coastal areas are very important. One example where they were able to do some economic analysis is oyster harvesting. And at the end of the century, under the higher level of emission scenarios, they consider the RCP 8.5 scenario. What they're seeing is projected declines in the oyster population, somewhere between 20 and 46%. But coming with that, projected price increases. So I'm not sure which side of the coin you feel about, or you are on that particular side, consumer or harvester, but it's a significant change for something that's been an important part of rural livelihoods. We're also known in the Southeast not just for agriculture, but we have a lot of jobs in food processing kinds of things. This is a example of, this is not a tomato processing plant. That photograph fell apart on me and I had to substitute asparagus, but the same idea holds. These facilities are going to face new challenges in terms of product availability, in terms of costs for supporting labor at tolerable indoor working conditions, and basically costs of shipping and manufacturing. So that part of what's happening in the rural South is also going to experience some stress, as is the large areas of livestock ranching. When you drive out in the rural South, you'll see not that much irrigation, but you will find large fields of cattle, sometimes dairy cattle. We have lots of hog and pig production in parts of the region, burros, donkeys, and in parts of the Southeast. We also raise a lot of the nation's horses. And all of these animals are vulnerable to heat stress, and the kinds of ways that they're cared for, whether it's indoors, outdoors, whatever kinds of facilities, are likely to need some modification under continuing heat stress. So there's another dimension to that heat vulnerability that will become part of overall adaptation in society. We're famous for peaches, right? The rural South, it's hard to talk about the rural South without thinking about the peaches that are here, but these are really an important crop for us. The trick to them is that they need a certain number of cooling days so that they can produce the fruit. And they also need warm temperatures during their development. And what we've seen in recent years is that sometimes the spring comes a little bit early, but we've seen concern about the number of cooling days. You can think about that right now. We're not getting the cooling days we're expecting here in December, January, as we're sitting here today. But there's also a situation where the warming temperatures can encourage these plants to begin development and flowering too early, and then you get a late season freeze impact, which also is very hard on harvest. So the kind of variability that we're seeing in the winter weather is a concern for rural agriculture endeavors. The forestry in the southeast, it's the highest value crop we've got. It covers up to 80% of the land in each state in the southeast. And you can see here on the map that it's an enormous variety of that. We have a great deal of corporate ownership. We have a number of smaller private holdings that require that people work together on different types of management strategies. So as we come to think about how we manage for change, it takes a lot more coordination when you've got more people involved than it does when you've got a single large, for instance, federal landowner who might be managing a large area. So there's sort of just a challenge in the way the land is distributed. But the jobs that we're looking at here between timber, logging, and all the support for those industries are about 458,000 for the Southeast. It's a significant part of what we're doing here. And in doing that, one of the key tools for managing wildfire risk in areas with so much forest cover is having access to prescribed burning. And the prescribed burns, like the one we're seeing here outside Charleston at the Naval Air Base, are an important tool for reducing the fuel loads and reducing the potential that there'll be a severe wildfire outbreak. The times when you can practice that tool, though, may be reduced by extended periods of high temperatures and drought conditions when it makes it inappropriate to burn safely. But we're also looking at potential risks to these forests through diseases, insect infestations that might result in tree mortality. So while there may be a greater need for this tool, we may find that there are limits to when we can practice it. So that'll be a challenge in these rural areas where there's so much forest cover. This is not a rural area. This is Charleston. I put this in here because it's such an expensive investment. This is hundreds of millions of dollars that are being invested in drainage improvements in Charleston, South Carolina, and it's an expensive investment. It depends on having the tax base, and interestingly, their bond rating agency recently reviewed Charleston and asked about their plans for sea level rise management and stormwater drainage, and they explicitly as part of determining their bond rating. Now, in the case of Charleston, they said that the economic development region was sufficient, that they weren't going to change their bond rating, but that, I think, is an important flag of kinds of questions that are going to come up. And these just simply aren't the resources that are available for many rural communities where the towns are small, tax bases are not of the scale they are in Charleston. But the stormwater drainage issues, the aging infrastructure, the disruption of transportation, the difficulty for people getting on emergency lifelines to hospitals or picking their kids up for school or all these other things are at risk for disruption and expensive change. So I wanted to just put that in there as a contrast to be aware of. Also in these rural areas, I kept in this photograph, it's kind of amazing, right? How many people does it take to carry a Burmese python out of the Florida Everglades? Well, apparently about 6 if you space them 3 or 4 feet apart. This is a huge snake. And they're sensitive to cold temperatures. They're expected to be favored by warming temperatures. I live in South Carolina. I hope I don't ever see one of these, but the potential for change and for seeing these are going to be greater risks in the rural areas where it's going to be difficult to monitor all invasive species over large swaths of land. Okay. I have mentioned that I'm concerned. There's a lot of concerns about the heat, and we've been able to do these other scientists have been able to conduct these economic analyses. And if they look at the changes in hours worked for the end of the century, so 2085 or so to the end of the century, what we're seeing is that there's a concern that you'll see about in some places, as much as 6.5% decrease in the number of hours worked, simply because the heat risk is going to become so high, and the length of the days that people can work will be shorter. Their need to take extended breaks for heat relief, to get into shade, to go to cooling centers or whatever is going to increase, and that's concentrated across the Southeast. Texas is not part of the Southeast NCA region, but you can see they're also very much part of this phenomenon. And that, so what does that mean? It means agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting, mining, construction, manufacturing, all of these kinds of activities that need to be scheduled with contracts and with expectations of timing and harvests and time to completion sorts of things are potentially influenced by this. It does come with very serious risk in the Southeast, these heat-related issues, and the reason for reductions in work hours. We are second in the number of farm workers hired among all the NCA regions. For the high-risk occupations that are agriculture, construction, manufacturing, mining, different types of sort of refuse removal kinds of things. We're 6 of the top 10 states with the highest heat-related morbidity in occupational health are in the Southeast. And the Southeastern region, as we know, it accounted for about 30% of the deaths in the United States in between 2000 and 2010. It's a pattern of concentration of risk that is significant for our rural communities. We've also got a lot of construction going on. I put this one in because there's nothing like the heat while you're on the ocean and the ocean's warm to really be something, and to have to wear your protective gear. The same situation here as we're looking at growing populations across the Southeast, and we have a demand for more people to be out there in these conditions wearing a fair bit of safety gear, which doesn't make it more comfortable at all. And finally, just to mention that we have a lot of military bases here. These occupational health risks extend there. They influence training, training patterns and preparedness, and the health of people who are serving in the military on our behalf. Okay. The other part that I want to raise about the heat, particularly standing out in the Southeast, or the rural areas of the Southeast, is that we're expecting to see a lot of changes in the cooling degree days. Now, a cooling degree day is when the temperature gets above 65 degrees. The way the climatologists calculate this, they start to think we're going to have to start investing in cooling. And for every degree above 65, you get a cooling degree day. So a day that's 75 has counts for 10 cooling degree days. And so it's sort of degree plus day as a unit of measure. And the pattern here in the Southeast is that while we know that those changes in cooling degree days are going to be concentrated here, we can also see that the patterns of rural or the non-metro counties in the United States that are experiencing persistent poverty are concentrated largely in the Southeast. You can see the Appalachian region stands out, the Black Belt of the lower Southeast stands out, the Mississippi Delta areas stand out as areas that are experiencing, the term is persistent poverty. This means that more than 20% of the households there are experiencing poverty that has lasted over 30 years. And that's true for 35% of the counties, and the majority of them are in these rural areas. And that, when, as we're thinking about patterns of existing stresses, this becomes one of them that interacts a lot with health, with labor availability, with other resources. But what we can say about this, and where I want to get close to ending here, is that we do know that the reduction of existing stresses can reduce the overall risks. So those, I've talked a lot about just the human physiology's need for cooling periods improvements in some of the substandard housing in rural areas is going on already and can continue to offer some relief as we think about how to manage and afford increases in heating degree days in rural areas. The people are actively confronting the challenges of reduced access to health care. One of the trends that has stood out in the Southeast, again related to health but in rural areas, is that we've seen more hospitals close in the Southeast than anywhere else. And so Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee all stand out as places where rural hospitals are closing, so the access to physicians, the distance that someone might need to travel to get to an emergency room, the frequency with which you can visit a doctor, all of those things are becoming more difficult and potentially inhibiting care that people might need under stress conditions. It's also, in the rural areas, been talking mostly about heat, but if we were to look at flood challenges or to think about the potential wildfire risks that we're looking at, rural areas have a disproportionate, when their emergency management capabilities are compared to other areas, they're seen as disproportionately low, and because they have often limited local government capacity to staff emergency management planning. They might rely, they do here, on a volunteer fire department, which involves a lot of extraordinary and brave people, but not necessarily people who have given the support for all the training that you ideally have. We know that many of the rural areas have limited modes of communication. Not all cell phone coverages cover all areas. Not everyone's got near the landline. The Wi-Fi service is in some areas very quick, in other areas very slow, if people can afford it. So we know that kind of pushing out messages can be an additional challenge. Even radio can be a problem if we're in the mountains, right? And the ability to reach people is more difficult simply because so many areas people are dispersed and the areas are remote, and the times to get there are longer. We also see that there are a limited number of vehicles for evacuating out of these areas. So were we to find a major inland flooding event like we've seen following recent storms in North Carolina, these kinds of challenges become particularly difficult in providing people the emergency services we'd hope to see. But they are challenges that we are aware of and challenges that we have capacity to address. They're not ones that need to stay as they are, and that's the good news about this. So I'd like to thank the chapter author team who helped so much on this. Adam Taranto from Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, Lynn Carter, who is the lead, and my other co-authors, including Aranzazu, and our technical contributors. I just want to say thank you. I'm happy to be open for conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Kirstin. I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to quickly pull up, before people get off the phone, I wanted to catch folks so they know how to find the information. And NCA2018.globalchange.gov. And here's just a little graph of when you come to the landing page on the National Climate Assessment, you can query things by summaries and overviews, but here on the right-hand side with the orange arrows, report chapters and then downloads. So for all of you on the line, all of the graphs that Kirstin showed in her presentation are available for quick download. So just so you know, should you be putting together presentations to brief your staff, your planning department, your students, all of those are quickly downloadable. And so the idea behind this report was also to help people be able to make decisions in their own community spaces. So just wanted to point that out quickly. And so volume 1, what we call volume 1 of the National Climate Assessment is the CSSR, or the Climate Science Special Report. and then volume 2 is the full assessment. And then lastly, I just wanted to let everybody know that next month we'll be doing an overview of the Caribbean chapter. We're done now with the 4 key messages for the Southeast, but we wanted to do the Caribbean since the Caribbean has its own chapter in this National Climate Assessment, and our footprint does cover the Caribbean, so Puerto Rico and US Virgin Islands. And that will be presented by Bill Gould on February 11th, and then the Tribes and Indigenous Peoples chapter in March 25th, specifically presented by Rachel Novak, who oversees the Tribal Climate Resilience Program of the BIA, and our own Tribal Climate Liaison, Casey Thorne Group, who's employed by the United South and Eastern Tribes. So here's our website. Please do sign up for our newsletter if you want more information, and we look forward to seeing you next month. But now we have the opportunity to spend some time with Kirstin and ask her some questions. So we'll open it up. Feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and or just raise your hand and go ahead and ask a question. Okay, let's see if we have any questions, and if not, we can start out asking a few questions. Yeah, please go ahead if anyone has a question. Okay, let's see. So let me ask, there's a question here coming through that says, Kirstin, is open source technology used to gather additional data to better inform local North Carolina farmers on how to increase product availability, proactive soil care, etc.?
That's a great question. The sources that I know of in terms of technology are really a variety of federal programs that are being done to monitor soil moisture, and that's an increasing area of investment. But I'm not aware of, other than through the extension services, what sorts of information is being provided directly to farmers on this. Maybe someone else on the call can answer the question more about specific aid to farmers.
Yeah, Kirstin, I'm just writing here to chat to everybody that yes, so NC State University does have a North Carolina Ag Extension, and I think they're increasingly more interested in climate impacts to agriculture. So that would be one resource. And then a second one is here on campus, we also have the USDA Climate Hub, and that would also be another resource for technology that's open source. So anything funded, by the government, federal government, is open source. And
so I do know they have things that you could sign up for, like a push alert if there's going to be heat stress on your livestock, for instance.
Right.
And that's something that's being addressed. But I don't know about augmenting. They've also, I know the Southeast Hub is very interested in the issues of soil salinization that people are facing along the coast. Sometimes these big hurricanes will push in a lot of salt water that might be held there by the berms that were protecting the farms, and we have some salinity issues. And the salinity issues in the east are not those in the west. We have salinity in too much water, whereas they have salinity in too little. So the solutions don't translate easily across that fundamental divide.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. And I also mentioned here the U.S. Climate Toolkit has, you can query it by sector, and I believe agriculture, so you can also see some of the sort of best practices that the farming community is using for climate adaptation. So that might also be a good source of open source technology or best practices. Okay, so we have another question here from Louise Vaughn. Let's see, are there any examples of small rural communities that are developing resilient strategies to prepare for the future that the assessment looked at?
I know there's a town of Kentucky whose name I'm forgetting right now that's looking at their health plans and doing increased preparedness around heat health there and other areas. It's interesting that all communities are actually being expected to do more. Under one of the requirements of receiving Medicaid support, all community agencies that get some sort of Medicaid dollars need to do training and preparedness, and many times the training and preparedness they're doing is informed by ways to reduce climate resilience or increase climate resilience. So they look at that and they say, okay, well, our annual training can be about climate resilience, and that's part of what we need to be doing. And they're encouraged to be doing that by their participation in this federal grant program. So there's quite a few people doing things in different scales. I don't have one large scale example.
Right.
Okay. Toolkit does have a couple of
Sort of sectors and pieces.
Right, right. And so yeah, I would again just mention again the Use Climate Toolkit where you can query it by ag, and then you can see some best practices that are being used by rural communities. So that's a good source of inspiration and suggestion and advice. We have another question here that says, this is more of a vulnerable population environmental justice question. Regarding the graphic with the cooling days and persistent poverty, do we know the demographics, sex, people of color, socioeconomic status, etc., for the workers mentioned, like refuse collection, construction, etc.?
We, no, I do not have information on the composition of who's involved in that in those different areas of employment, but we do know that some of the populations who are vulnerable for other socioeconomic reasons are certainly part of that workforce. I just can't tell you whether or not they're how deeply they are involved.
How that breaks down.
I think it's a good question. We know that the image I'm showing of persistent poverty maps against.
Okay.
Yeah, maps against patterns of ethnic difference, racial and ethnic difference as well.
Kirstin, are you pulling up a map from your presentation?
Oh, I was just putting up the change in cooling degree days again.
Okay, yeah. You'll need to share your screen again, Kirstin.
Okay.
Thank you.
There it is. Sorry.
Yeah.
So this area does have that persistent poverty.
Kirstin, we still don't see it.
Still don't see it.
Yeah, just try one more time. There we go. There we go. Got it.
If you look at it a little bit longer, that correlation with areas that have higher minority populations comes out fairly clearly in the map.
And Kirstin, just in terms of the source of information, that would be in the report, right?
Yeah.
Where this specifically came from?
This particular map is drawn from the USDA data on persistent poverty. And then the cooling degrees calculation was done by the North Carolina Cooperative Institute on Climate and Satellites in North Carolina, and the Eastern Research team did the change in cooling degrees days, so they overlaid these two things.
Okay, great. And just for everyone's information, when you see this graph in this chapter of the Southeast, every graphic and map has a source, so the metadata.
Yep. And some of the questions about going back and further interrogating the population differences in these counties could be done with those sources.
Okay, very good. Another question here, Kirstin. Would you care to comment on the great potential in the Southeast region for mitigation, solar energy, and afforestation, regenerative ag, etc.?
I could only do so in a, it's not an area that I know particularly well. I do know that we're we're in a good place to support a great deal of solar. I have not myself done a lot of research in those areas, but I realize that others have pointed out that we do have a strong potential. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kirstin. And I'm wondering, we have an energy sector chapter, do we not?
Yep.
So that would be another source to take a look at. I'm sure they probably did some look at different parts of the country for the potential for renewables. So I would recommend taking a look at that energy sector.
Yeah, that would be the most up to date. I know that I've looked at solar. I know it's good. I know it's good potential. I haven't looked at afforestation kinds of strategies myself, though.
Okay. Okay, very good. Kirstin, and since we have a few more minutes, I just wanted to ask you, could you talk a little bit about sort of the emphasis on the information the way that we provided this information, and it's much more risk-based approach in this fourth National Climate Assessment. Can you talk a little bit about the ways that the information is presented in such a way to really help people make decisions in whatever sort of sector they might work, but in particular regarding the agricultural and rural community sector?
Sure. So the information presented in the chapters is presented so that you get the risk at the low scenario is RCP 4.5. That's a scenario that would see a reduction in greenhouse gases in the relatively near term, 20 some odd year horizon, and would lead to substantial decrease in potential impacts. The RCP 8.5 emission scenario is one that doesn't see that same decrease in emissions globally, and allows for continued impact. So one of the first decisions that people can make as they're considering the risk is which scenario do they think that we're tracking most closely. At the moment, it's 8.5. It doesn't have to stay that way. The other reason to include both of those is you can see the significant difference in the pathways and the motivation for investing in greenhouse gas reductions. So that's the first risk kind of question you get. And then when you go through the other details, to the extent that we know the range of error around any estimate, those will appear in the text as well and tell you that. Third way we do it is to look at sort of a near-term, mid-century mark, as well as a longer-term end-of-the-century mark, so that different types of planning horizons can be incorporated when you're thinking about risk and scales of investments. And some of the things we do are really long-term. Once you build a road and people start to build around it, you may have to replace that asphalt in 50 years, but you've created a dependency around having a road there that endures past the lifetime of whatever asphalt you laid the first time. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily a planning horizon, but it's sort of a commitment when those choices are made, and you get a chance to look into the future on those. So those are three important ways they do that. In the areas of sea level rise scenarios, you'll also see that underlying reports will include the probabilities of different amounts of sea level rise at a decadal scale. So there's lots in there beyond what I've been able to show you today. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the other thing I want to say is the report does also pointed out that there are ways to mitigate these risks. Many of these risks are things that we've already had some experience with, but not at the same scale or intensity. And so knowing that we have strategies that can be applied is an important message here too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, that's right. Yes, we have another question here. Hi, Kirstin, thanks for a great presentation. Are there efforts to provide this information to state politicians? In Tennessee, our governor has established an initiative to help disadvantaged rural communities. It seems that this kind of information could be useful in that effort. Unfortunately, climate adaptation is not all that high on their list of priorities.
You know, I believe that there are efforts to try and communicate this kind of information out there. The NCA itself made a huge effort in rolling out this report, but also I'm just one of many people who are using different pieces of it to share and bring people's attention to it. Other kinds of more specific things are just the number of new initiatives that are coming up around things like public health and economic development that ask people that are giving more and more attention to climate changes and potential consequences. So I don't know exactly what the situation is in Tennessee, but I do know there's a lot more mobilization taking place nationally.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, we have just a few more minutes. Everyone's been really grateful for your presentation, so thank you, Kirstin.
Happy to talk with, and thanks for the great questions. It's an amazing time to see this information being sought out and people working to advance it and incorporate it. So I really appreciated the kinds of things that people are thinking about it and how it might be useful.
That's right. And Kirstin, just so you know, and everybody still on the line, we have made a recording of this presentation and we will put it on our website and we'll include it in our newsletter again. So if people want to refer back to this information or share this presentation with your colleagues, your friends, your neighbors, please feel free to do so.
Kirstin, if you still have time, this is Carrie. A question with regard to if you were to advise a student who is interested in this idea of vulnerability of rural populations in the future, where do you see as the hottest topic or the research topic that they could undertake, or expertise to acquire that would allow them to enter into this realm?
That's a great question. So there are multiple dimensions of the vulnerability concern here. There's a lot of concerns about public health vulnerability. I didn't go too far into that because I know you've heard about the health messages from this chapter. So that would be one area. The kinds of stresses that these kinds of climate changes place on people's physical health, mental health, occupational health are all very important. Other topics that are very significant are to get at some of the economic impacts of the disasters we're seeing. Jennifer Helgeson from the National Institute of Standards and Technology is working on understanding the impacts of business recovery. In many of these areas, not all rural areas, but many rural areas rely on a number of small businesses to provide basic needs. And those businesses, because of their size, because they may not have corporate backing, because they may not have a lot of employers or deep pockets, once they're hit by a severe flood event or other kinds of disaster, they're likely to have much more difficulty recovering. And that can really influence the recovery of the community. Say, if your gas station or local grocery store is slow or unable to recover, it can influence the whole community. So I'd have people think about business resilience and how that influences community resilience. I think about that. Ellie Davis, my PhD student, is looking at that in the urban setting, certainly relevant in the rural setting. Hazard management capabilities, huge question. What's going on with that? So those are just a number of thoughts. There's certainly many things to think about. Aaron Seecamp and Matt Jonas from NC State recently published a paper where they put together a sort of an approach for thinking about rural coastal vulnerability. And I encourage a student to look at that. It does focus on coastal issues, but it could be, with some creative thinking, it could be expanded to inland areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, thank you, Kirstin. Thank you very much again. And just to see if we
Happy
have...
to talk.
I think we're good with presentations. Well, I just wanted to bring back up our next 2 webinars in the series for everyone, and we'll be promoting these again. We hope that you'll share this information with your colleagues, your students, your friends, so that the more people, the better, can get informed, and especially directly from these authors. So with that, thank you very much to everyone who participated today, and especially to Kirstin, our presenter. We really appreciate your time and your expertise and your commitment to getting this information out. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We'll see you next month.